Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Libby Book Club. It's 2025. How did that happen? I'm your host, David Allan-Petale, and this is our very first edition of the Libby Book Club for 2025. And our guest tonight is the incomparable Dave Warner. Dave, welcome. How are you going?
Yeah, really good, David. Yeah, we're in the middle of a huge thunderstorm in Sydney here. But apart from that, very good. Nice to be here for the start of the year. I'm really pleased and honoured to be the first guest to kick off 2025.
Absolutely. It's great to have you. And I must say thank you for staying up because I think I'm in Perth, you're in Sydney. It's 10:30 where you are, I'm guessing. It's seven it's just button on 7:30 where I am. So people tuning in may have noticed that's a new start time. So for the rest of this year, we're actually gonna we're playing around with the start time. We reckon 7:30 is probably better for everyone to, put the kids to bed, get things done that they need to do, and us authors and interviewers can, we can stay up, can't we? So
Yeah. Well, would stay up and fall half asleep in the armchair, watching the movie or something. Yeah.
no, indeed, indeed. Well, look, before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people of the Noongar Nation. I pay respects to elders past and present and to their continuing connection to the land. Libby Book Club for WA is, of course, brought to you by the State Library of WA, Libby, and Overdrive. It's totally free. It's the Libby app is available for download right now, including with Dave Warner's new crime novel, When It Rains, which is our feature book for all this month. And I'm very happy to report, Dave, that the good people at Libby and at Overdrive have reported that we've got something like close to or over 1,000 ebook loans of When It Rains, and the audiobook's sitting at 500. So huge interest in your writing, but also just proof that there is such a thirst for a Dan Clements novel, isn't there?
Well, no, it's fantastic, and it's been, I guess, a bit of a hard road. Like my first book, City of Light, sold really well, particularly in Western Australia. But since then, it's been hard, to get at each one's a little bit more. So, look, I'm absolutely thrilled that there's people out there. I love working the libraries, and I'm so thrilled with Overdrive and Libby to give people this opportunity to read my work. Yeah, it's great.
Absolutely. People are really jumping in. And of course, our chat tonight, we've got a lot of participants tonight. If you have a question for Dave, please drop it in the chat at any time. And I'll do my best to weave it in. And also, just to give you a bit of incentive, we've actually got a copy of When It Rains that's going to be awarded to what I pick as the most influential question of the evening, the question that prompted perhaps the most discussion. So if you've got a burning question, something that you think is gonna really ignite our conversation, please drop it in the chat. It's all part of what we do here. So Dave, I'll start with a bit of a Dorothy Dixer. What is When It Rains about? Because this is a new adventure, a new mystery, a new situation that Dan Clements finds himself in as part of his regular run of work, but every now and again, Dan gets pulled into some pretty dark things. So can you just give us an introduction as to what the book's all about?
Sure. Well, this is the fourth of the Dan Clement novels, and news for anybody who hasn't read any of the books and wanders through a bookstore or a library is that while there is a continuation on them, they can be read independently. So you don't have to have read any of the other Dan Clements if you pick this one up at first. But where we find Dan at this point in his life is he's up there in Broome. Dan was originally a hotshot cop in Perth. He grew up in Broome. He went back to Broome to try and save a marriage that hasn't quite worked out. So he has a new girlfriend at this point. This is where he's at personally. But things are pretty dull there. And he's thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe I should go back to Perth. There's nothing happening here. And the idea of When It Rains, the title came from the idea of, be careful what you wish for, and it never rains, but it pours. And so immediately that he says it's dull here and there's no major crime happening, he's engulfed in major crime. One of his sergeants gets beaten up at the local tavern. A girl is horribly assaulted in a motel in Broome, and he starts to follow these cases and then finds himself in Kununurra. So a lot of this book is set a bit further over in the east, Kimberley over towards Kununurra, near the border with the Territory. And so he finds himself over there, and he's in the middle of this investigation as to what he thinks is a couple of tearaway people who might have beaten up his cop. When he finds, or when the remains of a body are found, somebody has been tied to a post in the river, which is crocodile infested, and all that's left really are a pair of feet encased in diving boots and a bit of a hand that was tied on a pole. So he then has to investigate that, and there's a lot of complexities in the cases and in the case, and Dan is I think forced to doubt himself a lot and wonder if he's actually lost it and can he keep going. And so I guess that's, and after that it plays out. I can't really give any spoilers for that, but there are a lot of twists and turns.
No, that's true. I've got to say, I devoured this book in about 3 sittings. So, I'll do my best to avoid those spoilers, but I leak out. Don't worry. Now, it starts off. Page one is of course, a map showing the Kimberley region, particularly focused on Wyndham and Kununurra, but also zooming out to show Derby and Broome. Can you tell us a bit about, I guess, this region that the book is set in, but also some of the things you touch on, where, Broome, Derby, Kununurra, these places, they're homes to people who, people live there all the time, but there's also a transient population of miners and workers. And instead of it being idyllic tourism or that kind of thing, there is a real harsh underbelly to these places, isn't there, that we don't necessarily hear of a lot of the time.
Well, look, I think it's the case of anywhere in the world where you've got really, really harsh conditions. And a lot of the reason that people are up there might be for things like mining, for example. So you're going to have transient people in those types of occupations a lot. Broome or Broome in particular, as people would know, is kind of an international tourist destination as well now. But it's on the edge of the desert, and which makes it really unique. But on the other side, Kununurra, you have these communities that are really, cut off. It's hours to drive anywhere. And I think, most Australians know the idea of someone gets in trouble with the law and they flee up to Darwin or far-flung places. And certainly, I was going to say until recently, that's not a bad place to go, because communications up there are not like they are in the rest of the world, even in the rest of Australia. And in fact, in this novel, it points out there's still a lot of areas up there where you can't reach people on the phone, and it's very difficult because of the distances between the towers to pinpoint where someone is. So there's a lot of challenges for the police in this area, quite apart from anything else. If someone goes missing, if someone might have been taken by a crocodile, but was it deliberate or wasn't it? It's really hard to get to the bottom of, because you've got vast distances to cover. And instead, where in most cop shows or cop books, people hop into the car and might spend 20 minutes speeding over the crime scene. Well, here you're in helicopters or light aircraft to try and get you to the destination of the potential crime scene. But they were some of the elements, which is great for me. I mean, I find it really fascinating. And as you say, I think that mix of tourism, of mining, and just people who they want to live out. They want to live outside the standard place. They want to be out in the Neverland, so to speak. So it's all an interesting brew for me to be able to put those characters into something.
And chapter 2, when Josh Shepherd, he's the policeman who gets bashed, he finds himself going along to a pretty rough sort of pub, but almost like half willingly, isn't it? He doesn't particularly want to be in this place. He knows that it's got danger, but he goes anyway, doesn't he? Because there's there's almost a fascination. Like you said, you're out there on the perimeter.
Well, yeah, I think in Josh's case, the reason he goes to the pub there is Josh is he's a big police sergeant. He's not the brightest one in Dan Clement's team, Josh, but he does like his sport, and he figures that, I think he gets invited there for the sort of Bucks night of the captain or an influential person on the cricket team or the footy team, and so he thinks, oh, well, I better go along. So half of Josh's reasoning is just to is quite ego driven. But those places can be like that, and people will tell you, oh, you don't go to such and such a pub on a Wednesday night or on a Thursday night or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the end, it's his mouth that really does get him into trouble, isn't it?
well, it's his mouth, but he's really just being a cop. I think there's a bit of a disturbance in the car park, and he tries to be the cop and say, hey, listen, watch what you're saying and watch what you're doing. And he ends up at the wrong end of some physical attack there.
I was very enthralled by the procedure that came after the bashing when Josh is taken to hospital and they start looking around, and then of course there's another assault at a motel room that perhaps could be linked. But I was a journo for a long time out in Kalgoorlie, and I remember a story where a policewoman was bashed. Female police officer was bashed on the Golden Mile, and the police response to that was overwhelming. It was like, it was all, people came in from all points, and they caught, like, the person they caught who did it. I wouldn't want to have been them. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly the rule, isn't it? That police are going to defend their own, and you don't blame them with good reason. And of course, Kalgoorlie, another great West Australian town, and that certainly has a history of knocking off a couple of the gold squad and dropping them
oh,
down dropping them down the mine shaft. So look, it is the Wild West to a large extent, and as you say, yeah, anything can happen in these places, and there's not necessarily a lot of you've got to be pretty tough to police the law up there. And my I was very fortunate for this book that it has got a lot more police procedural in it than what a lot of my other books have. And I was lucky. I've got a fellow named Rob Kirby who was in the WA Police Force for a number of years, and Rob actually he worked up there. Spent some time up around the Mitchell Plateau and stuff, and so he was a great source just in general, and also in the particular problems that police might find in these sort of areas.
I was going to ask you a bit about Rob because he's in your acknowledgements. You said you met him at an author talk.
Yeah, I was doing one, and it was up around Marmion Way up there, and I think it might have been Woodlands Library, might have been where it was, and he just came and introduced himself at the end of one of these little shows that I do with my guitarist Tony Durant. We're doing some in Melbourne in March, where I play a few songs and talk a bit about that, and also talk about my books and the interrelationship. Sometimes, if it's appropriate, of the music and the songs, and the books and the book titles. So I was doing that, and then Rob came up to me and said, "Look, if you ever need any help, give us a yell." And as I say, for this particular book, I was really grateful because I needed quite a lot of help for it.
Um, there's a question from Kathleen that chimes to this quite nicely. She says, "How much time have you spent in North WA, and what were some of your personal experiences there?" And perhaps shading that with some of the things you learned from Rob as well.
Yeah, the answer is not. I haven't spent a lot of time in North WA. I've done in my band tours. I toured several times, as a lot of bands would, over a short period of time, up through the Pilbara. From you'd go Geraldton up the Pilbara. You might play Newman. You might play Port Hedland for a week, and Broome and Derby. I'd done a couple of times. So when I did the first Dan Clement novel, I'd only been there, I think, yeah, twice, maybe three times, primarily only to Broome and Derby. A couple of years ago, I was very fortunate to be invited to the Kununurra Writers Festival, which is just fantastic. Kununurra is a small town, and there were about 8 or 9 of us writers. We've all become firm friends since then, and most of us, I think, have written books about the region since then. And then a year or so after that, I had my band together, and we were doing shows in Perth, and we got asked to come and play the Kununurra Ag Show. So I said to the guys, "Look, this is something you've got to do. It's a once in a lifetime experience." So we played up there again and again, toured around and had a look around there. But I rely a lot on. I certainly don't have local knowledge. I'm really just a tourist in that sense. So you rely initially I relied on people who had lived up in those regions to give me feedback on what I might have missed out on in the book, what are important things that you wouldn't normally consider. And you rely, of course, on Mr. Google and stuff. But the brilliant thing with the Northwest is that it's really hard to get anyone to actually agree on things like, how far does it take to drive from Roadhouse A to Roadhouse B? You'll get about 9 different answers. So I learnt that early on. So I've learnt to use the resource of people who've been who've lived there and been there, and be able to ask them, firsthand what they think.
Actually, that sort of sprung to mind. There's a line describing how Dan drives from Derby to Broome in like 2 hours. I'm not great with maths, but when I read that line, I knew he was speeding, wasn't he? He was going very
Yeah,
fast.
he was absolutely speeding. Yes, yeah, and that was I think when he finds out that Josh, his sergeant, has been bashed, so he's going pretty fast. Yeah, I have done that trip a couple of times. Yeah,
And sort of maybe just back to the procedural at the beginning of we're trying to find out what's going on. We're starting to meet, we're getting to know Dan, we're getting to know his new girlfriend, Lena, and also his team. So, it's kind of like, the clarion call went out and everybody knew they had to come in. So people are staying till 4:30 in the morning. Others are coming in at 6 o'clock. I think, is it Earl who comes in and brings him the big bacon and egg sandwich? It's all hands are on deck for this, aren't they?
yeah. Yeah, Graham Earl, yes, he's good mate who thinks of those things. And as you say, in something like this, when it goes down, the police he wants to solve it immediately. It's very personal. One of his own team has been attacked. Then you've got another situation where a young woman's been really badly beaten up and attacked as well, assaulted. So it is a matter of it's pedal to the metal for all of them.
And Dave, would you mind reading us an extract from When It Rains? That I think we talked about something right. It's quite at the beginning, right at the beginning, where
Yeah, yeah. I'll
quite a
find
prologue, chapter one.
I'll find a part in chapter 1 here. All right. Uh, okay, I'll read a bit from here. A few minutes. Despite her bound feet and her hands tied behind her back, she manages to roll on her side. She fights to get her torso off the deck, stretches her long neck up at a weird angle. Please, I'll do anything you want. Her words are soaked in desperation, but she can't bring herself to believe they will change anything. The bullet had been fired long ago. All this time it's been travelling unerringly to the target she'd painted on her own chest. The driver pays no heed to her, does not tell her to shut up, does not slow down or even reach around to clip her. For all she knows, he has earphones in listening to music. Perhaps it's the drugs, but she feels an inability to offer any further physical resistance. Hers is a resignation near total. For 8 years, her life has been shadowland. It seems that will soon come to an end. The creeping anxiety, the paranoia, leaves whispering in accusation, the derisive hiss of comas on even the most deserted of beaches. Another wave of anguish surges through her. Anything, she screams, going through the motions, but deep inside knowing the torpedo tube door is already welded shut. The lassitude settles over her again. Bronwyn got a part in a mini-series, didn't she? She'd forgotten that. Remembers now a rap party somewhere near Taylor Square. Genuine coke-off toilet lids. They'd gone their separate ways when the lease ran out. 9 years. Bronnie might be a mother by now. The first trip to the West had been a high point, no pun intended. Opportunities stretched in front of her like endless lines of coke. Shitty analogy. There's no invention in her now. Hadn't been for years. Her mouth opens to cry out, but this time all she manages are sobs. An image of a long ago Christmas Eve comes to her, satin pyjamas and coloured lights around her family garage, snacks laid out for visitors, white Christmas, nuts, pretzels. She helped her mum. It made her feel grown up. She'd waited in bed long after the guests had gone and her little brother had stopped chattering and plunged into dreamland. She'd waited full of determination and expectation, alert for the sound of reindeer hooves, and then she drifted towards oblivion, just like now. Finally, she had capitulated, her vigil unsuccessful. The car slows and stops, her muscles tighten. Terror has formed a mould around her, a full-body death mask. A back panel opens, air blows in, and she smells the bush and moisture, a river or creek. She feels a presence looming over her. Please, she starts before something pricks her neck. A thought struggles out. Maybe this is for the best. The veil descends over her. Her next conscious thought is that she's wet herself. It is dismissed almost the same instant. She's in water waist deep. Her hands remain bound, only now they are looped around a rough wooden post at her back. She yells into the cavernous night, her eyes adjusting to the moonlight, picking out wooden stumps encircling her like cricket fielders, perhaps the remnants of a jetty. But her legs, what's with them? She tries to lift her feet. They're heavy as lead. Suddenly she understands what's happened to her, the situation in which she finds herself, the awful symmetry of what's been prepared for her. This time when she screams, it's with a power that can only be generated by the most intense primal dread. They are out there, those prehistoric creatures. Her galloping heart taps out its telegram. Not this death, anything but this. Before she can wail again, she hears that slight suction sound when the massive reptile pulls itself from a muddy bank. She does not hear it enter the water, but even as she screams anew, she can feel the resultant ripples running up under her ribs. Her cry is still thrusting from her throat toward the moon, her tongue still trilling when the monster strikes, severing her body in two.
Wow.
Ta-da.
That's a hell of a way to start the book. And that stayed with me throughout. I love air blows in and she smells the bush and moisture, a river or a creek. You can just feel it. Uh, the sparse words, but all of them just so truthful and uh, just it just builds and builds and builds. Did you have to strip this language back quite a bit, or does it just come to you like a natural thing? Because it's quite lyrical as well.
Yeah, it is. Look, it's fairly natural. I mean, like anything, you work at it. The Dan Clement books are kind of like the halfway books for I would say, like they're some of my other books are even more stripped back, like Summer of
Oh,
Blood that you would have read, and Big Bad Blood that they're really stripped back, and consciously so, because of the effect I was trying to get with them and with those characters. And then once those characters are set, so these ones I think I try and I try and express probably pretty much in the feeling of the people who are inhabiting the page, the characters who are inhabiting the page, and up that way, they're not people who are going to talk a hell of a lot. You know, they're fairly laconic, and but the place itself still has this incredible imagery, that you just can't help but feel imbued with, and so in that sense, it ends up being, I think, by now a kind of a reasonable mix of the of the two things. And I get a few little passages like that where I can be a bit more lyrical, because I know that most of the procedural stuff or the action things, I really try and keep that short.
I also really enjoy your the tone you have as a narrator, like that freedom. You can be deadly serious, you can be extremely truthful, you can be lyrical, then you can be really funny. So we have Jeffrey Fairclough says, "I love the metaphor in chapter 8, a jar of Vaseline with a pubic hair." And you have these like Aussie turns of phrase, these clipped turns of phrase. Do you feel a freedom when you're writing, say, a Dan Clement book to you can just do whatever you want?
Well, you can, look, you've got to be true to the character if it's a Dan Clement one. But look, it is fun, and sometimes you forget good things that you came up with, or good similes or whatever. The Snowy Lane book, Snowy was the first one I wrote, and I really wanted, because those similes and metaphors were such a big weapon in the arsenal of people like Chandler, and I wanted to do a kind of West Australian version of that. I tended to use a lot of similes, maybe too many, but or metaphors, but they were fun, and people really associate that with Snowy Lane. So he's kind of right at that one, and those ones I do have to think about a bit, because I've got to go, okay, now what's going to work for Snowy? It's got to be something that he would think of. Whereas these ones, it's probably a bit more spread out for whoever the characters are, and in general. But it is fun. That's the ultimate thing. Look, all writing is fun. It can be hard work, and you have to be fastidious, as well. And but it's still fun. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it at the advanced stage I've now hit, David.
Well, can we talk? Maybe just let's dive into Dan, because when we meet up with Dan, he's at an interesting point in his life. Marriage, relationship with Marilyn's definitely broke down. He's living on his own, but he's got a new flame. But he's also just starting to realize how much he's been hiding from the world, hasn't he? He's been holding everything back and not really living. And now all of a sudden he's got a new flame and a very intricate and violent case to look into.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and I like that. I like trying to blend the personal life of the character, and also elements of the personal life that most readers can relate to reasonably well. And most people have been in that stage in their life where maybe they're embarking on a relationship and they're not certain of, there's a lot of fear associated with that. How much do you commit? And in Dan's case, his fear in a sense is, look, if I really go head over heels for Lena and she dumps me, she's younger than him in this one. Where does that leave him? And if he shapes his life in order to fit in with her and pull back on his cop world, that's kind of what he is. And I think for men in particular, we define ourselves so much from our occupation, and perhaps that's becoming more and more the case for women now. But for people from my generation, traditionally, it was incredibly important, for men. And without that, it was like, well, who are you? And their immediate thought was not in kind of some philosophical sense, but it was really went back to, what do I do for a living? And that was where their whole being was kind of centered around that. So for someone like Dan, he's got to think, one, he's just about to hit 50, so that's a milestone for him, and he's going, have I lost it in the field? A lot of the things that he thinks he's got for certain down on this case don't come to fruition. So has he lost it? Would he be better off pushing a pen and paper? And then in his personal life, where is he there? And he, is this is he prepared to to jump onto this steamer and sail off into the sunset? So, and I think people can relate to those sorts of life choices.
Definitely. And the character Lena's fascinating. She's tougher than Dan in a lot of ways. She's like a sort of like a spirit animal almost that he it sort of reveals a lot of his, not his shortcomings, but yeah, what he's been holding back, and yeah, what he's been sort of letting maybe go fallow a bit.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to put it. Like he, in the first book, he wants to get back with his wife, who's not necessarily, they have a great connection, but she's not necessarily that interested in getting back with him. And she's got another man in his life. And he finds this really, really difficult to accept. And he can't move on with his life. And when it breaks down in the next ones, he's still finding, and he has been trying, throughout then to move on with his life. And he is confronted with somebody like Lena, who is a free spirit. She gets on a motorbike and rides across. She's German, and she gets on a motorbike and rides wherever she feels like, and wherever she hangs a hat is home. So it's a very different personality for him to come to terms with from what he's been used to. And as I say, he's a cop. He's a 50-year-old cop who's got to come to terms with somebody who's European and 30 odd and riding around in on a huge motorbike. So it's definitely a clash of the worlds going on there.
Indeed, indeed. And Dave, can we maybe just talk about like I suppose the driving crime here in When It Rains? The thing it's alluded to in what you shared with us, that uh, we sort of have. Is there a bit of naivety in when we look at uh, regional WA in those areas? We think, oh, where do all the drugs come from? Oh, well, of course it's being dropped off, offshore, and then they're being floated in onto the beaches. Uh, why, when crimes happen up in the north, crocodiles can be a solution. There's a lot of, did it take you a bit to throw your mind there, or did speaking to Rob give you a bit of an insight into, no, this sort of crime is genuinely possible and in fact has happened?
No, this was all my own invention. Well, when I say it was all my own invention, as I say, when we writers were talking up in Kununurra and we were spinning yarns around, and I said, oh, look, it might be a really good, effective way to have because I always like to start the Dan Clement novels if I can with the big moment, the big scary moment when someone's going to lose their life. And in this case, it's that bit that I just read out there. And so I was talking with my fellow writers about maybe using a crocodile as an implement of murder. I thought, could be interesting. So it was only later that Rob came on, and it's one of those things when you write stuff, I want to write the story that as it appears to me without reference to, as I feel it, without reference to research, really, and then go to the research and see what changes I might have to make. Otherwise the tail wags the dog a bit. And so Rob was great that a lot of the things that I'd thought, well, is this possible? Because also when you're doing a crime novel, you don't want the cop to be successful straight away and to get to the solution. So, what are the sorts of problems that you can face? And there are a lot more problems than, what you might think. So that part of it is when you refine things. But in terms of the actual, let's have a crime with impact. Yes, I did think crocodile. I think it might have been the previous one. I think the guy was staked out on the road with nails driven through his palms after the flood. I think that's how that started out. So try and get something dramatic at the beginning.
And got some very nice comments in the chat for you, Dave. So Peter Newman was saying, "Love this book. I've read all of Dave's books, especially being set in towns I've lived in, Broome and Kununurra." And there's a follow up from him. He says, "Have you been to the top of Kelly's Knob, which gets a mention? In 1984, I walked up there a number of times, footy trading including. Enjoy, I really, enjoy the local landscape being included."
Yes, I have been to Kelly's Knob. I've been there a couple of times now, and it's very impressive when you're in Kununurra and look up there, and then when you go up there. But I didn't walk up there. I was a cheat. I drove up there. So I did do a bit of walking around the place, but and it is, it's pretty stressful walking around some of those places for an old bloke. And I walked to Emma Gorge one day, and I get quite travel sick, and looking down on the rocks to make sure I didn't fall over and break my leg, and looking up all the time. By the time I finished it, it was like I'd been on some sort of whirligig whizzy ride, and I was as sick as anything. And Sonia, who's a writer with me, who's the doctor, she was sure I was about to keel over with a heart attack, and I said, no, it's travel sickness. It's just exactly the same. So it's not for the faint-hearted doing that stuff up there.
Dave, what was it like for you after Summer of Blood, with last one we chatted about, to come back to the character of Dan and to be in Dan's world again? To not even just to revisit this character, but to re-inhabit him and see what he's doing. Because we got a question there from Kathleen. It says, "Where do you get your ideas for the Dan Clement books? Is it the stage he's at in life, or is it a particular crime, or is it what happens when you mash both of those things together?"
Yeah, look, well, that's an interesting question, because the first one, my whole basis with Dan Clement when I started off, I had this idea around, it was 2005 or 2006, and at that stage I was writing a lot of television, but I wanted to get back to writing books. I'd written a number of books up to about 2000. But then I had to take a break. I was writing TV things, and I was reading books by Swedish author Henning Mankell, who wrote the Wallander series, and James Lee Burke in particular, American writer, crime writer. And in those things, the location is as big a character, maybe the biggest character of anything in the book. In Henning Mankell, it's the frozen fir forests of Sweden, southern Sweden, and James Lee Burke, it's Louisiana and the bayou and all that. So I wanted to have a location that was as important as that. So that was my starting point, was I'm going to do something here. And then I worked out a crime, and I thought if I set something in the Kimberley, which is really unique, I want the other part of this case to be kind of international and be as far away from the Kimberley as what you could think. And I chose Hamburg. So my beginning in that first book was, this is where the case is going to be. In the second book, have I got that here? Yeah, this one, Clear to the Horizon, which was the second Dan Clement one. It's actually also Snowy Lane. So it's Snowy Lane, who was my first detective on City of Light, and Dan Clement together in that book. And that starts off from Snowy's point of view, and then they both end up following, a crime that was inspired, you might say, by the Claremont serial killings, which people in Western Australia are intimately familiar with. And the genesis of that story was, I was sitting here this is 2016, and I was sitting here in my place in Sydney, and there's a knock on the door, and I opened the door, and there's two gentlemen in suits, and they said, "Oh, are you David Warner?" And I thought initially, oh, well, perhaps they're selling me some religious things or something. And I said, yes, I'm David Warner. And they said, "Are you familiar with the Claremont serial killings?" And I said, yes. And they said, "Well, we're detectives from the Cold Case Crime Squad in Western Australia, and a number of people have named you as a suspect. So could we interview you?" So I said yes and invited them in. And anyway, we chatted and they interviewed me, quite properly. I gave a DNA sample. They said, "Oh, look, we're checking out people from all around the place, anybody. And while we're here in New South Wales, we'll check you out." And that book was kind of inspired by that. I hadn't really wanted to do anything on the Claremont serial killings, but in my first book, City of Light, the Snowy Lane book, I had three young women disappear from Netherlands. So it was, not dissimilar to and that came out in October 1995. And then the Claremont serial killings, the first of the young women disappeared Australia Day 1996. So 3 months after my book came out. So perhaps people thought somehow or other, I was trying to get book sales. But anyway, that was the genesis of that book. And I thought, I'm going to bring Snowy Lane, and I want Snowy Lane and Dan Clement together to kind of solve the case. And I had my own theories about the actual real case, and I tried to put that into play. And then the third book, which was after the flood, and I just had this image which started the thing, which was of this person a man who was kind of crucified to the road at the start of the book. And then I started to think, well, I thought that would be a great image to start the book, but why would somebody be in that position? What's happened to them? And, yes, they could be a drug courier, but apart from that, what would be a kind of more interesting thing? And that led me into the thinking, well, what if it was some kind of fanatical people who wanted to do something big, like blow up the gas pipeline in the northwest, and they thought someone was a traitor, so all the ones are different. And for this one, it literally came, When It Rains, it came from the other names of the books that I had. I thought, I really want to do a Dan Clement book. I just want to get back and see where Dan's at, see where all the other people are there, where Graham Earl and the others, what's happened to them. And when I've got Before It Breaks, Clear to the Horizon, After the Flood, I need something that's got that kind of ring to it. And When It Rains, It Pours came. And so the genesis of that was, okay, what if Dan's sitting there and it's boring, there's no crimes happening, and then as soon as he thinks that, we have some really complicated crimes that take him everywhere. And then I just matched that with the idea that I had in Kununurra at the Writers' Festival, that a crocodile should be the murder weapon. So they're all from different sources, if you like.
And of course, when it rains up north, you can also get cut off, can't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I wanted to just, this is kind of a philosophical question, but because there's a great line in chapter 5. It's just an example. It says, what's up? Cleary manners, summarily wrenched from sleep, understood the significance of an early weekend call. I just love the clipped way that you write that, and it sort of links to were you inspired by Raymond Chandler? Raymond Chandler writes in a way that's unmistakably American, and you're known, boy from the burbs. Dave Warner's from the, everything about you is like Australian and proud. where you come from, representing that. I saw you speak at the 2018 WA Day, where you talked a bit about that. It's about connecting to where you're from and using the vernacular and honoring all of that. Does that sort of that really comes through in the work? Is that something that sort of is dear to you?
Oh, absolutely, and it's what I call a veracity, I suppose. But veracity can have a wide variety of things, and so this is a veracity in the sense that I write as I hear the patterns of speech and the way people talk, and the way maybe that to an extent other writers that I really enjoy. I mean, it's not a conscious thing. I don't sit there and go that they this, but it's definitely there. Um, and so what happens is that, but not all my books are like that, because some of them are a bit different. And I had Over My Dead Body, which was Sherlock Holmes coming back in New York. He's revived after being you know frozen by Dr. Watson, and he comes back in 2018. So that required a different feel, like a different tone. The tone of Dan Clement is he's Australian, he's West Australian, and he's a reasonable sort of guy. So that's kind of the tone that he's going to have. In Big Bad Blood and Summer of Blood, the detectives are Sydney detectives, and one of them, Ray Shearer, he's a bent cop, and so his tone and is different again, and the way he speaks. And Sydney's a different town, so it's rendered in a different way. And the book that I've got coming out in 2026 will be different again, because it's set in 1929. It's my homage, if you like, to Agatha Christie and those Golden Age novels that I love. So that will be different. So I guess it's a long-winded way, David, of saying that when a story occurs to me, it kind of presents itself in almost in a complete way, like not written, but I have a feeling of the tone and the character, the style of story, and then that is going to determine how it's going to be rendered, if that makes sense. So, while and veracity to me is really just, do I believe what the characters are doing? They don't have to be Australian. They could be Martians up in, Martians might be stretching it, but they could be, astronauts in Mars or something. But do they follow basic human principles? Do I believe that that's what that people would do? And in the case of these things, is that what I believe a WA cop would do, or is that what I believe somebody who is trapped in a panel van would do? So they're the yardsticks that I use. But I'm glad that most people do seem to enjoy it, and particularly I think Australians and West Australians, who for a long time we didn't have that. We didn't have our own crime literature, if you like, to entertain us in that way.
Yeah. And Dave, you've got 13 books now, and we were told before through the Libby app you can now get all of them in the one go, and you're also sitting there alongside Chris Hammer, who's got quite a few too. So, is it heartening for you that readers around the country are just they have a thirst for these, for stories, for Australian stories? Like you said before, it doesn't have to be Australian, but or by Australian writers. That there's, we're really embracing what we have and what we can have.
Yeah, absolutely. Australia, unfortunately, in one way for uh, the kind of older Australian crime writers like myself who were there before, where I think when I started, there was only about 7 of us writing crime in Australia. And Shane Maloney in Melbourne. I think Gary Disher was probably in Victoria, and Peter Corris up in Sydney. There's only about 6 or 7, no one in Western Australia. And now there's about 7 different, crime novels come out every week. So in terms of being a crime writer, it means it's a very flooded field, and it's difficult to keep your head above all the others coming out. But the great thing is that people are responding to it. Readers are enjoying it. International readers, unfortunately, my stuff is not read widely internationally. I haven't got a publisher out there who's doing stuff. I wish I did, But it's a great thing that Australian writers can get international profile as well, make some real money and make a living. But at the same time, Australians are loving seeing themselves reflected on the page, if that's probably a bad metaphor.
I was gonna say it's also probably true with music. What role does music play for you in writing? Because that's also a huge part of you of your artistic identity, but also just part of you.
Yeah, well, look, when I first the first book that I wrote, City of Light, 19 I started around about 1991, 1992. I was here in Sydney with not much going on, but I'd always wanted to write a book, and I thought I could do a crime book, and I was a big fan of crime writing, and so I thought, well, why don't I try and do something that's been successful for me with music? So with Dave Warner's From the Suburbs and my music, the idea was that it was West Australian, it was suburban, it was Laminex table, football, sex, frustration, and vast distances, and heat. So why don't I take those elements and use those elements as crime writing? So that was a really conscious effort to say, well, people responded to it in a musical sense, maybe they'll also respond to it as a written thing on the page. And then there are other kind of elements that are probably not as obviously direct as that. So, for example, Before It Breaks, that first of the Dan Clement books, I didn't know what the story was when I sat down and when I had this idea, look, I'm going to do something set in the Kimberley, and I want to really try and create that location as a character. But what I did have was a song that I'd written for my fourth album called Waiting for the Cyclone, which has this, it's all these people who are up in the northwest or the Pilbara waiting for the cyclone to hit, and there's that sweaty tension and expectation, and you can't do anything, you're just waiting. And I knew if I could get that tone into the book, it would work because the song worked, So that was a kind of more tangential application. And then in something like Summer of Blood, I had just grown up with music with that era of the 60s, especially the psychedelic era. And yeah, and I just always, I thought, oh, it would just be fantastic to do a story that somehow put a couple of Australians. It was my vicarious 13-year-old, Dave Warner, transporting himself to San Francisco to solve a crime, really.
And when it rains, there's a lot of music in it too. I love that it's still one of the ways Dan judges someone. So Lena doesn't really impress him in that she at the beginning because she likes you too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dan's, yes, I think Dan has some of my elements there, which he goes, well, they're okay, but is this song really the greatest song that I've ever heard? So, yeah, Dan likes Dr. John and a few kind of more old time R&B people as well.
I was going to say as well, yeah, that's a recurring theme, isn't it? A recurring metaphor: right place, wrong time, or yeah, wrong place, right time. But it applies to everyone who bad things happen because you were in the wrong place. But
Yeah.
some people in the book as well, they've placed themselves deliberately uh, in the wrong place.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So things are going to come looking for you. If you knock on enough doors in the bad part of town, something's going to happen to you. Metaphorically, I mean, and yeah.
So, well, I've got a really great question here from Amanda Polinsky. She's saying, Dave, do you follow the rigid structure that people say you have to use as a crime writer, or do you just write how you want?
Okay, well, it's going to depend a little bit. So I think on the very first novel that I did, I just had an idea, City of Light, and I sat down. I'd never done a writing course, creative writing course in my life, but I just read a lot of crime books. And that took me a long time to write that book, and it was an organic process. And I went back and rewrote quite a few times to get it out. Since then, I do tend to plan things out a lot better, but things will always change within them, and depending on the sort of book that it is, things might change more. So, for example, in this one that will come up in that's set in 1929, of Sound Mind and Dead Body, it's called. Because it's an Agatha Christie style book, there are certain conventions that I want to follow that Agatha Christie would use, and red herrings and way the story is told, and so there is a kind of structure imposed to that. But look, it's whatever works for me. Some books are more rigid than others, but I do tend to follow. I really do tend to know where I'm going to finish up roughly when I start putting real pen to paper. I'll plot out a structure, a rough structure in 12 or 14 beats. But once I start writing, I have an idea. But other writers have a completely different process to that. So it's whatever works for you. And for some people, they just like to, like to let it flow, and, oh, that's a good idea. And then they work it through. So I don't think there's no right, no wrong. And I certainly don't think anybody needs to follow a rigid structure.
And maybe just as a follow-up to that, Dave, do you find that if you come up to a stereotype, or what you think is a stereotype, is it good to go around it, or is it good to also lean into it? Because sometimes there's gold there, isn't there?
Well, well, this again, it depends kind of what story you're talking about. Now, in an Agatha Christie thing, there are characters who are archetypes, I guess you could say, or stereotypes, and I don't mind that at all, because she's really working on it. It's very much the plot and the wizardry of how she works the plot that's important, and her detective, and the other characters are chess pieces. But I certainly try and steer clear if I feel that this is what every second crime novel is doing at the moment. I really try and steer clear of that. So, for example, I don't think I've got any of my characters who are any of my detective characters who are alcoholics or have some mental problem. And that's just for me, because I think that's such a well trodden path. And if you're doing a series, I think it also gets, to me, it can get a bit much by the time you're in the fifth or the sixth book, and the character's still trying to, cope with his or
Yeah.
her alcoholism or whatever. So I do try and steer clear of stereotypes, but I think it would be wrong to go, oh well, I'm not going to do that because that's a stereotype. Maybe it's a stereotype for a good reason, And as I say, if it comes back to have veracity, do I believe this character would do it? Do I think these people would do that? Then for me, that's the important thing. And sometimes, yeah, you are doing a stereotype, but like one of the funny things I say to people, about the only happily married cop in the entire pantheon of crime fiction at the moment is Barnaby or whatever in Midsummer Murders. Everyone else is single, depressed, sex addict or gambling addict or something.
It's funny. I've just recently I've been reading like the Rumpole stories, or Rumpole.
Yeah.
I forgot how, yeah, he's just a he hates being a lawyer. He likes to drink. He doesn't like his wife very much. It's hilarious. But maybe just on that, there are, with police procedures, there are certain things that you can look at, but I love that you show police work in its drudgery, but also in the strange happenstance that happens. That they'll get these breakthroughs in the case that they would never have expected, but it just comes from working the phones and working the facts and being really diligent. Is that an interesting thing for you to be able to play with? Because at any moment you can solve the case, or you can go off on a tangent.
Well, yeah, and I think, as I said before,
Yeah.
one of the things as a crime writer is you don't want to solve it too quickly. So you often have to think about, what are the hurdles that I can give myself? Why aren't I going to get it right? And the great thing is you are writing the book. It is fiction. You are the author, so you can play with things, but you don't want to make it too easy or too ridiculously hard, or and but it's fun too. And I often get get some fun. I often get some fun with the with what goes on in the last bit. Look, the puppy has been taken over, David.
Sorry,
Well,
Dave. I'm just being invaded. Go.
I don't blame them. They're having fun, and you know, got the new puppy. Yeah.
No, do. Sorry. No. For anyone tuning in, we just got a new puppy, so the girls have brought him back. So, Dave, we've got about 5 minutes left. So if anybody has a burning question for Dave Warner about When It Rains or any of his other books, please jump in the chat and let us know. But Dave, you mentioned a little bit about this next book that you're going to be writing. But have you got any other Dan Clement stories on the boil? Is there anything else that you would like to maybe even just
No, I don't know. Like Dan, I'm not sure about. I've got a number of stories on the boil. I have a Snowy Lane. I think the next one that would be a West Australian kind of big crime one will be Snowy. I've got an idea for a Snowy Lane one, and you know what usually happens is I think of, oh, this would be an interesting idea for a crime, and then who's the best? Do I have a detective in my stable who is the right person to be investigating this, or a main character? Doesn't have to be a detective. Um, and then if so, so I think that what I've got in mind will work better with Snowy, and so yeah, I've got that. I've got, for those people, there are a few. I've showed you before, this book Espresso, which was one of I think it's about the third book that I did, set in Kalgoorlie. That one we mentioned, Kalgoorlie, or largely in Kalgoorlie and Perth. And I love those characters. That's more a kind of Elmore Leonard style, Carl Hyacin, more rompy type of feel to it. So I'm doing a follow up to that, Double Espresso. So that's also, I've just finished the first draft on that. There's always something to do, you know, like or keep myself occupied. But I'm not sure about Dan, because, as I say, the trouble is you get to 4 or 5, and exactly as you say with the stereotypes, I go, no, I'm not sure. Should he be with Lena? Should she have left him? Should he have left her? You know.
right, yeah, and you can't let him live happily ever after because yeah, no, it's that's like solving the crime, right? Like yeah.
Well, no, maybe you can, because then you certainly would be avoiding the stereotype, but you'd want to find the yeah, you'd still want to have a decent crime in there.
Absolutely. Well, though, we've got not much time left, so I just want to pick our winner tonight. I think the question that's prompted the most discussion, I think it was from Kathleen, which is where do you get your ideas for the Dan Clements book? So, Kathleen, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. It's very old school of me. So just if you just email me your address, we will get that posted out to you as quick as we can. So that'll be a copy of Dave Warner's When It Rains. Dave, how does it feel to have such a great response from Libby, from readers across Australia to your book? I mean, that's a hell of a lot of borrowings. That's 500 listeners on the on
Oh,
the.
it's fantastic. Yeah, it's really great. I'm absolutely stoked, to use the old surfing term. And one of the things like with music, I say to people, with a band, you can go out and play, and if you write a new song, you can go out and play it, or you can play to the audience, and you get immediate feedback. You know whether things are working, whether people like it or what they like, and people can come up to you and say, "Oh, we liked this," or "Could you do that?" When you're doing a book, it's a much more secluded existence, and you don't necessarily get that feedback. So it's terrific to have that, and I'm really appreciative. I'm glad that people are really, getting into reading the Dan Clement ones, and I hope they go back and read all the earlier ones too. As I say, it doesn't matter if you've read When It Rains; you can go back in any order really and read them, or any of the other books for that matter. Yeah.
No, and they're all available on Libby. So, and Dave, are you planning to come to WA at anytime soon? Any appearances we can hang out with you at?
Look, I haven't planned one, but I'm sure that there will be something this year. Yeah. At the moment, my next thing is Melbourne. I've got some gigs lined up at the end of March and early April, and I haven't done those for a while. But I'm doing a few libraries there, so I don't know if anybody from Melbourne or heading to Melbourne is there. Come and check us out. And we're doing Castlemaine Fringe, which will be good fun too. But yeah, I'm sure I'll be coming to Perth again, and I'd love to get to those regional areas.
That's great. Well, and look, we'll end it with a comment from Jordana saying, "Wonderful book. You've got lots of great comments in the chat there, Dave. So, thank you very much for joining us here on the Libby Book Club, and really appreciate you staying up pretty late. Like it's
Oh, it's
no.
absolute pleasure. Yeah.
Look, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you, Dave, for a wonderful chat. You're such a generous subject to share everything about when it rains with us and all your process. Really appreciate it. And to everybody who joined us tonight, really great to have you for our first edition of the 2025 edition of Libby Book Club. So see you next month, and thank you very much. See you later.